The static crackled through Colonel Marcus Redfield's headset like breaking glass, each burst of white noise punctuating another plea for help that would go unanswered. From his position in the makeshift command bunker carved into the rocky hillside of the Helmand Valley, he stared at the radio with the hollow expression of a man who had already written the obituaries of the soldiers he was about to abandon. "Bravo 7 Actual, this is Firebase Talon," came the desperate voice of Lieutenant Jake Morrison, barely audible through the interference and gunfire. "We've got 37 wounded, ammunition running critical, and hostiles closing on 3 sides. Request immediate CASCVAC and close air support, over." Redfield's weathered fingers hovered over the transmit button, trembling not from fear but from the weight of impossible mathematics. 3 companies pinned down across a valley that had become a killing field, enemy forces numbering in the hundreds, and a rescue operation that would cost more lives than it could save. The decision had already been made at levels far above his pay grade, communicated through encrypted channels with the cold efficiency of a surgical amputation. "Bravo 7 Actual," Redfield's voice emerged steady despite the storm in his chest. "Be advised, no assets available for immediate support. Recommend you find defensive positions and prepare for extended engagement." The silence that followed lasted exactly 7 seconds, long enough for Morrison to process that rescue wasn't coming, long enough for 37 wounded soldiers to understand that their government had performed the brutal calculus of war and found them expendable, long enough for hope to die in the mountains of Afghanistan. "Sir," Morrison's reply carried the weight of understanding, "are you telling us to dig our own graves?" Before Redfield could respond, a different voice cut through the frequency, call sign unknown, tone calm as morning coffee. "Firebase Talon, this is Reaper 11, inbound your position for close air support." Every head in the command bunker turned toward the radio. The duty officer, Master Sergeant Helena Cruz, frowned at her screens showing empty airspace. "Sir, we have no birds in the air. No scheduled missions, no emergency scrambles." Redfield keyed his mic. "Unknown aircraft using call sign Reaper 11. Identify yourself and state your authorization for this frequency." The response came with the kind of quiet confidence that belonged to someone who had already made peace with whatever was coming next. "Reaper 11 is an A-10 Thunderbolt operating under emergency combat authorization. Firebase Talon, I see your smoke. Beginning attack run on hostile positions." Through his binoculars, Redfield scanned the valley floor where Bravo Company had been fighting for 18 hours. The distinctive silhouette of an A-10 Warthog emerged from the eastern ridgeline, flying low enough to count rivets, its twin engines howling like mechanical thunder. Whoever was flying that aircraft had just committed an act of insubordination that would either save 37 lives or destroy their own career in the process. The question burning through Redfield's mind wasn't whether this mysterious pilot could pull off a miracle. The question was who had the stones to try. The A-10 banked hard left, disappearing behind a rocky outcropping, and the valley held its breath. Captain Vivian Ghost Thorne had been dead for exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds when she made the decision to save Bravo Company. Not literally dead, though the bureaucrats at Personnel Command had already processed her discharge papers with clinical efficiency, stamping her military career with the kind of administrative finality that suggested she had never existed at all. Her security clearances had been revoked, her access badges deactivated, her nameplate removed from the squadron-ready room where it had hung for 8 years. But nobody had thought to ground her aircraft. The A-10C Thunderbolt II designated tail number 7080697 sat on the tarmac at Bagram Airfield, engines cold but fueled and armed, waiting for a pilot who was supposed to be 3,000 miles away processing her separation from the United States Air Force. Instead, Ghost was in the cockpit running her pre-flight checks with the mechanical precision of someone who had performed these same rituals over 400 combat missions. Her hands moved across the switches and gauges with muscle memory older than conscious thought. Fuel pumps on, hydraulics checked, flight controls verified, weapons systems armed. The familiar ritual provided a thin barrier against the chaos of the last 72 hours, when her world had collapsed with the clinical efficiency of a controlled demolition. The charges had been fabricated, the investigation predetermined, the outcome decided before she ever walked into that sterile conference room at Peterson Air Force Base. Conduct unbecoming an officer, failure to follow lawful orders, the kind of language that transformed 8 years of exemplary service into a cautionary tale about pilots who thought too much and questioned too little. Colonel Patricia Hawthorne, her former squadron commander, had delivered the verdict with the emotional range of someone reading a grocery list. Captain Thorne, you have been found guilty of violations under Articles 86 and 134 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. You are hereby sentenced to forfeiture of pay and allowances, reduction in rank, and dismissal from the service. What the court-martial had not mentioned, what could never appear in any official record, was that Ghost's real crime had been asking the right questions about the wrong operation. 3 months earlier, she had refused to provide close air support for what intelligence claimed was a Taliban stronghold, but which her targeting pod revealed to be a wedding party. Her insistence on positive identification had prevented a massacre, but had also embarrassed people whose careers depended on maintaining certain convenient fictions about precision warfare. The frequency crackled in her headset. Firebase Talon, this is Bravo 7 Actual. Reaper 1-1, whoever you are, you just saved our lives. Ghost banked the A-10 around the southern ridge, her targeting systems painting laser designators on muzzle flashes that bloomed like deadly flowers across the valley floor. Through her heads-up display, she could see the tactical situation with crystalline clarity. Bravo Company had been caught in a classic L-shaped ambush, pinned down in a natural depression with nowhere to run and rapidly diminishing options for fighting back. Bravo 7 Actual, Reaper 1-1, she replied, her voice steady despite the fact that she was committing career suicide in real time. I've got eyes on approximately 200 hostiles in prepared positions, beginning gun runs on the eastern ridgeline. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon was not designed for subtlety. Ghost lined up her first attack run with the mathematical precision that had made her one of the most effective close air support pilots in theater. The A-10's 7-barrel rotary cannon fired depleted uranium rounds at 65 rounds per second, each projectile capable of penetrating tank armor at ranges that other aircraft could barely reach with precision-guided munitions. The sound was apocalyptic. When the GAU-8 opened fire, it produced a distinctive growl that earned the A-10 its nickname among ground forces, the Warthog. But to Ghost, flying 200 feet above the valley floor at 300 knots, the cannon sounded like judgment itself, each burst erasing another pocket of enemy resistance with mechanical efficiency. Her first pass eliminated a mortar position that had been dropping rounds on Bravo Company's casualties for the better part of an hour. The second pass silenced a heavy machine gun nest that had prevented any movement from the natural depression where Morrison's troops had taken cover. By the third pass, the surviving enemy forces were breaking contact and withdrawing toward the northern ridgeline. Reaper 1-1, this is Firebase Talon. Colonel Redfield's voice carried a mixture of gratitude and confusion that Ghost found grimly amusing. Outstanding work. Can you provide identification and squadron assignment for our after-action report? Ghost pulled the A-10 into a climbing turn, checking her fuel and ammunition status with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to multitask at 400 miles per hour while being shot at by people who wanted her dead. She had enough gas for maybe 2 more attack runs before she would need to find somewhere to land, and landing was going to present its own set of complications. Firebase Talon, Reaper 1-1, negative on identification. Consider this a gift from someone who thought you deserved better." The radio fell silent for a moment, and Ghost could picture the confusion in that command bunker as military personnel tried to process an act of insubordination so flagrant it bordered on the surreal. Anonymous close air support was not something covered in standard operating procedures. When Redfield finally replied, his voice carried the weight of someone who understood exactly what he was witnessing. "Reaper 1-1, whoever you are, Bravo Company owes you their lives." Ghost checked her watch. She had been dead for exactly 47 minutes, and she was just getting started. The concept of being invisible had always appealed to Ghost, long before it became her call sign during pilot training at Vance Air Force Base. Even as a child growing up in the blue-collar neighborhoods of Tucson, she had possessed an unusual talent for observing without being observed, for moving through spaces where her presence was neither expected nor particularly welcome. Her father, Master Sergeant Raymond Thorne, had spent 26 years maintaining F-16 Fighting Falcons before a hydraulic leak had ended his career and left him with lungs that wheezed like a broken accordion. He had taught his daughter that mechanical systems were more reliable than people, that aircraft responded to competence rather than politics, and that the sky was the only place where merit mattered more than connections. Her mother, Elena, had been a high school mathematics teacher who spoke fluent Spanish and treated equations like poetry. From her, Ghost had inherited a love of precision and an intolerance for sloppy thinking. Elena had died when Ghost was 16, a victim of cancer that had been diagnosed too late because military healthcare had determined that her symptoms were psychosomatic until the tumors became too large to ignore. The combination of her father's mechanical expertise and her mother's intellectual rigor had produced a pilot who thought like an engineer and flew like an artist. Ghost had graduated third in her class from the Air Force Academy, earned her wings at Vance with distinction, and been selected for A-10 training at a time when most of her female classmates were being funneled toward transport and aerial refueling missions. The A-10 Thunderbolt II was not a glamorous aircraft. Built around the GAU-8 Avenger cannon like a flying gun platform, it was slow, ugly, and designed for missions that other pilots considered too dangerous or too mundane to be worth their time. The aircraft's titanium bathtub cockpit could withstand direct hits from 23 cannon fire. Its redundant flight control systems could operate with significant battle damage, and its ability to loiter over targets for extended periods made it invaluable for close air support missions. Ghost had fallen in love with the Warthog during her first training flight at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base. Unlike the sleek fighters that dominated aviation recruiting posters, the A-10 was honest about what it was: a weapon designed to protect ground forces and destroy enemy armor, flown by pilots who understood that glory was less important than getting the job done and bringing everyone home alive. Her call sign had been earned during a training exercise at Red Flag, when she had managed to avoid detection by enemy radar for an entire simulated combat mission despite flying an aircraft roughly as stealthy as a brick. Her instructor pilot, Colonel Mike "Hammer" Henderson, had laughed when he realized what she had accomplished. "Thorne, I've been watching the scope for 3 hours looking for your aircraft," he had said during the debrief. "Either you crashed and nobody told me, or you figured out how to make an A-10 invisible." "Just staying in the weeds, sir," she had replied with the kind of understatement that became her trademark. "Kid, you fly like a ghost." The nickname had stuck, following her through advanced training, her first assignment to the 354th Fighter Squadron, and eventually to Afghanistan, where she had built a reputation for arriving when least expected and delivering precise fires that eliminated threats without endangering friendly forces. Now, pulling the A-10 into another attack run over the Helmand Valley, Ghost reflected on the irony that her invisibility had become literal. According to every official record, she no longer existed in the United States Air Force. Her security clearance had been revoked, her access to classified information terminated, her very presence in Afghan airspace a violation of federal law that could result in imprisonment. But Bravo Company was still pinned down, and Ghost had ammunition remaining. She rolled inverted and began her fourth attack run. Target acquisition systems painting laser signatures on muzzle flashes that had begun to flicker and die as enemy forces realized they were facing a pilot who had no intention of leaving until the job was finished. Lieutenant Jake Morrison had been commanding Bravo Company for exactly 9 days when the ambush hit, and he was discovering that military leadership textbooks had not adequately prepared him for the psychological complexity of watching his soldiers die, while requesting support that would never arrive. At 24, Morrison possessed the kind of optimism that belonged to officers who had never been forced to choose between bad options and worse ones. The mathematics of their situation had become increasingly clear over the 18 hours since the ambush began. Bravo Company had started the patrol with 43 soldiers. 7 were confirmed dead, 37 wounded to varying degrees, and ammunition had been reduced to whatever they could scavenge from the casualties. The natural depression that provided their only cover was surrounded on 3 sides by enemy positions that had been prepared with the kind of tactical sophistication that suggested professional military training. Morrison had called for CASEVAC, close air support, artillery, and emergency resupply. Each request had been met with bureaucratic language that translated to the same fundamental message. Bravo Company was on their own. "Sir," Staff Sergeant Maria Gonzalez had said during a brief lull in the fighting, "what's our play here?" Morrison had been trying to formulate an answer that balanced honesty with morale when the distinctive sound of a GAU-8 cannon had rolled across the valley like mechanical thunder. Through his binoculars, he watched enemy positions disappear in clouds of dust and debris as an A-10 Thunderbolt made attack runs with the kind of precision that belonged in aviation textbooks. The transformation was immediate and absolute. Muzzle flashes that had been constant for hours suddenly began to diminish and disappear. Heavy machine gun positions that had prevented any movement from their defensive perimeter fell silent. Mortar rounds that had been dropping on their position with metronomic regularity simply stopped. "Bravo 7 Actual, this is Reaper 1-1, came the calm voice on the radio. "I show enemy forces withdrawing from your position. Can you confirm status of your casualties?" Morrison keyed his handset with fingers that shook from adrenaline and exhaustion. "Reaper 1-1, Bravo 7 Actual. We have 7 KIA and 37 wounded, various degrees. Our medic says at least 8 need immediate surgical intervention." "Copy that, Bravo 7 Actual. I've got CASEVAC birds inbound your position, ETA approximately 20 mics." The silence that followed was filled with the kind of hope that Morrison had not allowed himself to feel for the better part of a day. CASEVAC helicopters meant medical evacuation. Medical evacuation meant that his wounded soldiers would live to see their families again. The mathematics of survival had suddenly shifted in their favor, and Morrison found himself struggling to process the emotional whiplash. "Reaper 1-1, he finally managed. "How did you get CASEVAC approved? We've been requesting medical evacuation for 18 hours. The pilot's response carried the kind of dark humor that belonged to someone who had learned to find amusement in bureaucratic absurdity. "Sometimes it's easier to ask forgiveness than permission, Bravo 7 Actual." Through his binoculars, Morrison watched the A-10 banking around the eastern ridgeline for another pass, its pilot maintaining overwatch despite the fact that enemy resistance had been effectively neutralized. There was something deliberate and protective about the aircraft's flight pattern, like a shepherd watching over a flock. Staff Sergeant Gonzalez crawled over to Morrison's position, her uniform torn and bloody, but her expression carrying the first genuine smile he had seen from any of his soldiers in almost a day. "Sir, who is this pilot?" Morrison adjusted his binoculars, trying to read the tail number on the A-10 as it completed another lazy orbit around their position. "I have no idea, Sergeant, but whoever they are, they just saved our lives." The sound of helicopters approaching from the south confirmed that CASCVAC was indeed inbound, and Morrison felt something in his chest that he had forgotten existed: the possibility that good things could happen to people who deserved them. Master Sergeant Helena Cruz had been monitoring military frequencies for 12 years, long enough to develop an almost supernatural ability to distinguish between routine radio chatter and communications that indicated the kind of situation that would generate congressional investigations and end careers. The conversation she was listening to between Reaper 11 and Bravo Company definitely belonged in the latter category. From her position at the communications console in Firebase Talon's command bunker, Cruz had watched Colonel Redfield's expression evolve from confusion to amazement to the kind of grim understanding that belonged to career officers who had learned to recognize acts of professional suicide when they witnessed them. Someone was flying an unauthorized close air support mission to save soldiers who had been written off by higher command, and that someone was about to face consequences that would make a court-martial seem like a vacation. "Sir," Cruz said quietly, "I'm showing that squawking 7700. Emergency transponder codes were serious business. 7700 indicated a general emergency that required immediate attention from air traffic control and emergency services. It was the kind of code that aircraft used when they were experiencing catastrophic mechanical failure, or when pilots were declaring their intention to land at the nearest available airport regardless of air traffic control instructions." Redfield stepped over to Cruz's console, studying the radar display that showed Reaper 11's transponder signal painted in bright red against the green backdrop of the tactical display. "Any communication from air traffic control?" "Negative, sir. Bagram Tower is trying to raise them on guard frequency, but no response." Through the bunker's reinforced windows, they could see the continuing its protective orbit around Bravo Company's position, occasionally breaking off to investigate potential threats on the surrounding ridgelines. The pilot was flying with the kind of aggressive defensiveness that suggested they had no intention of leaving until every wounded soldier was safely aboard a medical evacuation helicopter. "Cruz, can you pull up the aircraft registration for that tail number?" Cruz's fingers moved across her keyboard with practiced efficiency, accessing databases that would normally require security clearances several levels above her current authorization. The result appeared on her screen within seconds, and she felt her stomach drop as she processed the information. "Sir, that aircraft is assigned to the 354th Fighter Squadron at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, but according to the flight schedule, it's supposed to be in depot maintenance." Redfield leaned closer to read the registration details over Cruz's shoulder. "What about the pilot?" "That's where it gets interesting, sir. The aircraft was last flown by Captain Vivian Thorne, Coulson Ghost, but according to Personnel Command, Captain Thorne was discharged from the service 72 hours ago following a court-martial." The pieces of the puzzle began assembling themselves in Redfield's mind, with the kind of horrible clarity that accompanied most military disasters. A pilot whose career had been destroyed was flying an unauthorized mission in an aircraft that should have been undergoing maintenance, providing close air support that had saved 37 American soldiers' lives, while simultaneously committing enough violations of federal law to ensure her imprisonment for the foreseeable future. "Sir," Cruz continued, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had just accessed information she wished she could forget, "I'm also showing that Captain Thorne's security clearances were revoked, and her access to classified information was terminated as part of her discharge proceedings." Redfield stared at the radar display, watching the friendly blue symbol that represented Reaper 11 maintaining its protective orbit around Bravo Company. Somewhere in that aircraft was a pilot who had sacrificed her career, her freedom, and quite possibly her life to save soldiers she had never met. The sound of approaching helicopters grew louder as CASEVAC birds began their approach to the landing zone, and Redfield found himself wondering how Captain Vivian Ghost Thorne had managed to convince medical evacuation crews to risk their own careers by responding to an unauthorized request for support. "Crews put me on Reaper 11's frequency," Redfield said finally. "I need to talk to this pilot." The GAU-8 Avenger cannon was empty, which meant that Ghost had approximately 15 minutes of fuel remaining before she would need to make some very difficult decisions about where to land an aircraft that had officially become stolen government property. The CASEVAC helicopters were on final approach to Bravo Company's position, their rotors churning the dust into miniature tornadoes that would provide additional concealment for the medical evacuation. Through her targeting pod, Ghost watched soldiers loading wounded comrades onto stretchers with the kind of desperate efficiency that belonged to people who had learned that speed was the difference between living and dying. Lieutenant Morrison was directing the evacuation with competence that impressed her, ensuring that the most critically wounded were loaded first while maintaining security around the landing zone. "Reaper 11, this is Firebase Talon Actual." Colonel Redfield's voice carried the weight of command authority that Ghost had learned to recognize during 8 years of military service. "Request you contact me on secure frequency for operational debrief." Ghost checked her fuel status again and made the calculation that had been lurking in the back of her mind since she had committed her first act of insubordination by taking off without authorization. She had enough gas to reach Bagram Airfield, where military police would be waiting to arrest her the moment she shut down the engines. She had enough gas to reach Kandahar, where the same scenario would play out with different personnel but identical results. She even had enough gas to attempt a landing at one of the smaller forward operating bases, though explaining her presence would present its own complications. What she did not have was enough fuel to escape the consequences of her actions. "Firebase Talon Actual, Reaper 11, she replied with the calm that belonged to someone who had already made peace with the inevitable. "Negative on secure frequency communication. Consider this mission complete." The last CASEVAC helicopter lifted off from the valley floor, carrying wounded soldiers towards surgical facilities that would save lives that had been written off 18 hours earlier. Ghost watched the helicopter disappear over the southern ridgeline, then pulled the A-10 into a climbing turn toward the west, where the afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the mountains. Her fuel gauge showed 12 minutes remaining, maybe 15 if she leaned the mixture, and reduced power to minimum sustainable settings. The mathematics of her situation had become as clear as Alina Thorne's favorite equations. She had enough fuel to reach Pakistani airspace, where landing without authorization would create an international incident that would overshadow her domestic legal problems. Or she could attempt something that pilot training had explicitly warned against, something that violated every regulation in the Air Force manual, but might provide a solution that served everyone's interests. Ghost keyed her radio one final time. "Firebase Talon Actual, Reaper 11. Tell Bravo Company that someone was watching over them today, and tell them that sometimes the best orders are the ones you choose not to follow." The radio went silent, and Ghost Thorne began her final approach to a landing that would either demonstrate the ultimate act of military defiance or provide a lesson in why pilots were taught to follow orders regardless of their personal opinions about the wisdom of those orders. The mountains of Afghanistan had witnessed the destruction of empires, and today they were about to witness one pilot's decision to choose conscience over career. The concept of stealing government property worth approximately $18 million had not been part of Ghost's original plan when she had walked onto the tarmac at Bagram Airfield 3 hours earlier. Her initial intention had been significantly more modest: retrieve her personal belongings from the aircraft, say goodbye to the machine that had been her partner for 400 combat missions, and then begin the process of adjusting to civilian life. But plans had a tendency to evolve when exposed to the reality of soldiers dying, while bureaucrats calculated the political costs of rescue operations. Ghost had been loading her flight gear into a sea bag when the radio chatter from Firebase Talon had filtered through the maintenance hangar's communication system. Master Sergeant Tony Valdez, the crew chief responsible for her aircraft, had been listening to the tactical frequency while performing routine inspections. "Captain, you hearing this shit about Bravo Company?" Valdez had asked, his expression carrying the kind of disgust that belonged to career military personnel who had learned to recognize institutional failures. "Sounds like they're getting hung out to dry." Ghost had paused in her packing to listen to Lieutenant Morrison's increasingly desperate requests for support, each plea met with the kind of bureaucratic language that transformed military necessity into political inconvenience. 37 wounded soldiers, ammunition running low, enemy forces in prepared positions, and rescue operations that had been deemed too expensive in both political and material terms. The decision had not required extensive deliberation. "Valdez, what's the status on 780697? She had asked, referring to her A-10 by its tail number. "Fully mission capable, ma'am. Fueled, armed, and ready for flight. Supposed to go into depot maintenance next week, but all the paperwork's still pending." Ghost had looked at her sea bag, containing the personal effects of a military career that had been terminated with prejudice, then looked at the aircraft that had carried her safely through 400 combat missions. The mathematics of the situation had been as clear as her mother's favorite equations. Bravo Company needed close air support. She had the training and equipment to provide it, and the bureaucrats who had destroyed her career were the same people who were willing to let American soldiers die to avoid political embarrassment. "Valdez, if someone were to ask you whether you saw me in this hangar today, what would you tell them?" The crew chief had studied her face with the kind of recognition that belonged to people who had served together long enough to communicate without words. "Ma'am, far as I know, you were never here. Far as I know, that aircraft took off on an authorized training mission." Ghost had nodded and began her pre-flight inspection with the methodical precision that had been drilled into her consciousness through thousands of hours of flight training. External inspection, cockpit preparation, engine start procedures, communications check, weapons system verification. The familiar ritual had provided a thin barrier against the magnitude of what she was contemplating. Taking off without authorization was a violation of federal law. Flying into combat airspace without proper clearances was an act of military insubordination. Providing close air support for an operation that had been specifically denied by higher command was career suicide that bordered on treason. But 37 wounded soldiers were career suicide of a different kind, the kind that would follow her into civilian life and ensure that she never slept peacefully again. The engines had spooled up with their characteristic whine, and Ghost had taxied to the active runway with the confidence of someone who had learned to trust her training more than her superior's judgment. Tower control had cleared her for departure on what they assumed was an authorized training flight, and she had been airborne within 10 minutes of making her decision. Now, with fuel running low and the consequences of her actions becoming increasingly clear, Ghost found herself wondering whether Master Sergeant Raymond Thorne would have approved of his daughter's decision to choose conscience over career. She suspected he would have been proud. The landing approach to Forward Operating Base Chapman had not been designed with A-10 Thunderbolt aircraft in mind, which presented Ghost with a series of technical challenges that would have been merely difficult under normal circumstances, but became genuinely life-threatening when combined with critically low fuel, and the knowledge that military police would be waiting for her the moment she shut down her engines. Chapman's runway was shorter than optimal for A-10 operations, surrounded by mountains that created unpredictable wind patterns, and equipped with approach lighting that had been designed for helicopters rather than fixed-wing aircraft. Under normal circumstances, pilots were required to obtain special authorization before attempting to land at Chapman, authorization that required advanced coordination with base operations and air traffic control. Ghost was operating under circumstances that were significantly less than normal. Her fuel gauge was indicating approximately 7 minutes of flight time remaining, which eliminated most of her options for alternative landing sites. Bagram was 15 minutes away. Kandahar was 22 minutes. Chapman was 6 minutes away, assuming she could successfully navigate the approach without crashing into the mountainside that bracketed the eastern end of the runway. Chapman Tower, this is Reaper 11 declaring emergency. Request immediate landing clearance, she transmitted on the tower frequency. The response came immediately. Reaper 11, Chapman Tower, state the nature of your emergency. Ghost paused for a moment, considering how to explain that her emergency involved stealing an $18 million aircraft to provide unauthorized close air support for soldiers who had been abandoned by their chain of command. The aviation regulations covering emergency landings did not include a specific category for acts of military defiance. Chapman Tower, Reaper 11 is experiencing fuel emergency, approximately 5 minutes remaining. Request vectors for straighten approach to runway 27. Reaper 11, Chapman Tower. Turn right heading 260, descend and maintain 3000, runway 27 cleared to land. Emergency vehicles are rolling. Through her heads-up display, Ghost could see the runway approach lights beginning to emerge from the haze of dust and heat that rose from the desert floor. Chapman appeared below her like a small island of civilization carved from hostile terrain, its perimeter marked by concrete barriers and razor wire that testified to the ongoing nature of military operations in Afghanistan. The A-10 responded to her control inputs with the mechanical reliability that had made it her favorite aircraft, flaps extending, landing gear deploying, engine power reduced to approach settings. The familiar rhythm of landing procedures provided a momentary respite from contemplating the consequences that awaited her on the ground. Her approach was textbook perfect, which would probably be noted in the incident report that would become part of her criminal prosecution. Ghost touched down on Chapman's runway with the kind of precision that belonged in flight training demonstrations, engines spooling down as she applied wheel brakes and began her taxi to the parking area where emergency vehicles were already waiting. Through her canopy, she could see military police vehicles positioned around the aircraft parking area, their occupants preparing for the arrest of a pilot who had committed enough violations of federal law to ensure her incarceration for the foreseeable future. The mathematics of justice were as clear as everything else about her situation. Stealing government property, operating aircraft without authorization, violating restricted airspace, and providing military support for unauthorized operations. Ghost shut down the engines and began her post-flight procedures with the same methodical precision she had used for 400 previous missions. External inspection, systems shut down, aircraft secure. The familiar ritual would be her last act as a military pilot, and she intended to perform it correctly. When she finally opened the canopy and climbed down from the cockpit, Master Sergeant Patricia Chen, the base military police commander, was waiting for her with handcuffs and a concerned expression. "Captain Thorne," Chen said quietly, "I need you to place your hands behind your back." Ghost complied with the kind of calm that belonged to someone who had anticipated this moment since making her initial decision to provide close air support. "Sergeant, can I ask you a favor?" "Depends on what you're asking, ma'am." "Make sure someone takes care of 780697, Ghost said, nodding toward the A-10 that had carried her safely through her final mission. "She's a good bird. She deserves better than sitting in an evidence locker." Chen secured the handcuffs and began reading Ghost her rights under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, each word carrying the weight of a military justice system that had learned to process acts of defiance with bureaucratic efficiency. But as they walked toward the military police vehicle, Chen leaned close enough to speak quietly. "Ma'am, word is that you saved 37 soldiers today," she said. "That ought to count for something." Ghost looked back at the A-10 one final time, its angular silhouette stark against the Afghanistan mountains. "Sergeant, 37 soldiers going home to their families is the only thing that counts." The concept of being processed through the military justice system had always been abstract to Ghost, until she found herself sitting in a holding cell at Forward Operating Base Chapman, waiting for transportation to Bagram Airfield, where formal charges would be filed, and her legal representation would be assigned by personnel who understood that her case represented a public relations nightmare of unprecedented proportions. The cell was Spartan but clean, containing a cot, a small table, and a copy of the Uniform Code of Military Justice that someone had thoughtfully provided for her review. Ghost had spent the last 6 hours reading the sections that pertained to her situation, discovering that military law contained remarkably comprehensive coverage of the crimes she had committed. Article 86, Absence without leave. Her departure from Bagram Airfield without authorization qualified as abandoning her assigned post, even though she had technically been discharged from military service. The legal complexities of her status would provide employment for military lawyers for months. Article 121, Larceny and Wrongful Appropriation. Taking an A-10 Thunderbolt worth approximately $18 million definitely qualified as grand theft, regardless of her intentions or the outcome of her mission. Article 92, Failure to obey order or regulation. Flying into restricted airspace without authorization violated approximately 40 different regulations, each carrying potential criminal penalties. Article 134, General Article. The catch-all provision that covered conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline, which would certainly include providing unauthorized close air support for military operations that had been specifically denied by higher command. The mathematics of her legal situation were as clear as everything else about her circumstances. She was facing potential imprisonment, financial ruin, and the kind of criminal record that would make civilian employment virtually impossible. The fact that her actions had saved 37 lives would be noted in the record, but would not constitute a legal defense under military law. A knock on the cell door interrupted her legal research. Master Sergeant Patricia Chen opened the door with an expression that suggested she was delivering news that she did not particularly want to share. "Captain Thorne, you have visitors." Ghost looked up from the legal manual with curiosity rather than hope. Military defendants in confinement were entitled to legal representation, but attorneys typically scheduled appointments rather than arriving unannounced. The possibility of family visits had been eliminated by geography and the classified nature of her situation.